Welcome to 584 Vetoes, the podcast that's a lot like the U.S. tax code. Too long, overly complicated, and isn't raising enough revenue. I'm Tom Church.
I'm Danny Heil.
Today, we're talking about our favorite subject, price regulation in healthcare.
Woo.
Danny, how you doing today?
I'm well. How are you, Thomas?
I'm good. I'm glad you're getting your wife back from a trip. Hey, so we're talking about price regulation because we've had this article. We passed it around in June when it came out. It's in JAMA. It's titled, "It's Time to Consider More Price Regulation in Healthcare." And obviously that is triggering for you and me a little bit because we don't love the idea of price regulation so much, just in general. Healthcare is one of those industries where everyone thinks, well, we've got to do it there. We don't want to do it anywhere else. So this article by Sherry Glide and Amitabh Chandra, they approach this from, people have been trying to control spending in lots of different ways. They mention ACOs, they mention value-based payments, they mention high-deductible healthcare plans, and they think that the next wave is just focusing on prices. And they bring up two examples. One, they're talking about manufacturers with patents. I'm guessing we're talking basically drug manufacturers. And then hospitals without competition. And they go ahead and say, listen, in competitive markets, price regulation, not a great idea. You end up with suboptimal allocations of goods. You end up with all these different inefficient problems. But in non-competitive markets, maybe there's actually something there. I'd love to know, Danny, are we wrong on healthcare price regulation? Is it true that we just need to look at the certain parts of healthcare that aren't competitive and regulate prices and see if we can improve things that way?
No, I don't think we're wrong. I think it helps to go back to sort of where a lot of this started at. And this is back to like 2003. There was a rather famous, at least in our circles, health affairs piece. Uwe Reinhardt of Princeton and a few others. And the piece was called "It's the Price is Stupid." And essentially their thesis was the thesis of this new JAMA paper, that the problem with U.S. Healthcare is it's high cost because the prices are high. Doctors get high reimbursement rates, hospitals get high reimbursement rates, drug makers get big payments for their particularly compared to other countries. And so their answer was price regulation. And over the last 20 years, this has really animated a whole lot of how healthcare so-called reformers think about healthcare. It was certainly the ACA. And since then, it's been with the public options that, you, Tom, and I have done a lot of research on. And then it's certainly something where, we see when you talk about Medicare for all or anything like that. So it's a long held belief, but it's rests on the same sort of faulty assumptions that we can go through history and look at a bunch of other examples of price regulation and see it time and time again, right? Tom, actually, another area that Tom and I did research way back when in grad school was on telecommunications regulation. And if you're familiar with, how that regulation looked for several decades, the argument was that AT&T had this natural monopoly. It made sense just to have one big telephone company that would regulate everything, and then the government would sort of price regulate them and limit how much they could charge. And they tried a whole different ways to regulate them, and ultimately none of them worked, led to less innovation. And then what they ended up doing is coming up with better ways to regulate. So we'll get into more of the weeds here, but I think the key insight here is that they're not wrong to think that prices are too high. They're wrong to think that government can just simply push prices down with a lot of bad side effects.
All right, a couple things you've said here. One, I like this notion right now. SpaceX just caught the booster from the what's that enormous one called? Anyway, it was incredible. They caught it, and people are going back to back and putting the NASA's SLS rocket program next to SpaceX, where SpaceX has spent like a few $1 billion to develop this whole thing and as reusable rockets. And NASA has spent $24 billion on the SLS system, and it hasn't launched anything yet. And this is kind of go back and forth of competing visions of, all right, have the government do things versus competitive markets. But the thing is, people will see that and go, yeah, that makes sense. Government's inefficient. They spend a lot. Fine. Healthcare is too important. We have to. It's just a different market. You got to convince me of that. So you said price regulation of the ACA. What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, when you think of what the Affordable Care Act did, or it's really interesting now. Nobody actually calls it Obamacare anymore. It took 10 years,
Obama
but
wasn't in office. He hasn't
we
been in office for
finally
a while. Yeah.
we finally started calling it the ACA.
Yeah.
So the Affordable Care Act included what was effectively price regulation over insurance companies. That they told insurance companies that, hey, if you have older people who have high healthcare costs and you know they're going to have high healthcare costs, you're not allowed to charge them as much as you would if the market were free.
This is the community
So
rating
this
you're
is
talking
community
about.
ratings. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in community ratings, you're essentially permitted to only charge a 64-year-old 3 times as much as you are allowed to charge an 18-year-old, regardless of their health risks. And this was a way to ensure that a 64-year-old's health insurance premiums were less costly. But it's just a price regulation. And even back with the Affordable Care Act, I know your next question is going to be what's the public option about?
Yeah, because
and
I guarantee almost no one listening to this that we make listen to this knows what the public option is, because it's still not out there, right? Go ahead.
I mean, I assume everyone that we're going to share this with reads all of our work, and
Right,
so knows
exactly.
that we
The
love
last
the
couple
public
years
option.
we've done all this work. Yeah.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work on the public option, and even back in the Affordable Care Act, there was a move to include a public option, which would have essentially been, rather than insurance companies having their own health insurance plans,
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have the government offer a health insurance plan that will compete with these other companies.
Right. Good. We like competition. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, and the math said it would save a lot of money. CBO said that this would save a lot of money, because what the government health insurance plan would do, or at least what they said they would do, is pay doctors a whole lot less and pay hospitals a whole lot less. And essentially what they would simply do is say, let's link it to Medicare reimbursement rates. Whatever Medicare is paying, that's what we're willing to pay.
Right.
And private health insurance companies freaked out, said, well, we obviously can't compete with that because you have this market power. You could push doctors into this position maybe. And ultimately, you're going to be able to outcompete us. And of course, doctors and hospitals freaked out because they realize that if the government actually succeeds in lowering these reimbursement rates, then there's a few hospitals in rural communities that are going to get kicked out of business, and there's a whole lot of doctors who are going to be unhappy, and there's a whole lot of future doctors who are going to become lawyers.
Hang on, you haven't convinced me on this just yet, or at least the hypothetical me that doesn't know anything about the public option. Because I think one thing we often hear is, let's use the government's buying power to drive prices down. What's wrong with that? I mean, then the public option, one thing we haven't mentioned is how premiums would have been charged to people. The public option wasn't free. It was, we're going to offer an insurance program that people are free to buy into, and we're going to charge premiums at the actuarial amount that would cover the costs of the program. So
On average, yeah.
On average. So what's wrong with the government being like, okay, prices are way too high. We're going to use our power basically through Medicare price setting to drive them down.
Yeah. So the first one is government's not terribly good at that. What we've seen over the years, Medicare is a great example of this. Medicare does pay doctors and hospitals less, but not to the degree that they were sort of hoping for over the years. That back in
They
the
being the
1990s, the government,
Yeah.
they're policymakers, they back in the 1990s, they had the Sustainable Growth Rate program, which was essentially
SGR, the doc fix, right?
The
This is what it became.
SGR. Well, we'll get to the doc
Okay,
fix.
came to it,
obviously.
yeah.
So the SGR was this idea of, we're paying doctors way too much in Medicare. We need to start cutting how much we pay them. And so they came up with this elaborate method to try to discourage or try to limit how much they pay docs. And it worked for like 1 year. And then in the second year, the AMA came a knocking and kindly asked Congress to override the SGR formula just for that 1 year.
Right.
And the next year, the cuts would have been even larger because the benefit formulas were linked to that initial the initial baseline.
Mm-hmm.
And so docs came back a second year and a third year. And eventually it just became this inevitable. Every year we have a doc fix where the AMA's lobbyists went to the halls of Congress and said, you can't do this. You're going to destroy a bunch of doctors' practices. And we need to avoid that. So, that's a great example. In one of our public option papers that Tom and I have written with Lon Hee Chen, we go through a whole lot of other examples within Medicaid efforts where all of a sudden they realize that, gee, we're not paying primary care doctors enough in Medicaid because it's, people are having a hard time finding them. Let's just bump up their payments. And so you see this time and time again. And so it's not that the government isn't theoretically capable of pushing down prices. It's that the politics are really hard. And it's not just the federal government, right? There are states who are trying to do these things. There's a handful of states that have begun to implement public option plans in Colorado and in Washington State. They've actually started putting people into these public option plans, and they're not really public option plans when you look at them. The government doesn't offer insurance. What the government is doing is they're going to private insurance companies and saying, hey, you're going to take people at premiums that we'll kind of regulate and make sure that you're not raising premiums by too much. And then we're going to help you get reimbursement rates down for doctors and hospitals. And in Washington State, they initially tried it, and it wasn't terribly successful. It turned out that a bunch of hospitals just said, well, we're not going to do business with the public option plans.
Mm-hmm.
So Washington State came back and said, well, if these hospitals don't participate, then they're going to lose access to employer networks that the government employer networks and things like that. So there's options for the governments to do this. But even in like Washington State, their initial goal was to set provider reimbursement rates at Medicare levels.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the end, it was at 160% is what hospitals were getting reimbursed.
Right.
And you see a similar experience in Washington State where they had these ambitious targets in Colorado. Thank you. They had these ambitious targets of what the rates were going to be pushed down to. And then all of a sudden the insurance companies came back to the insurance commissioner and said, well, gee, the hospitals are refusing to negotiate any further, that they think they've been tapped out. And
they were already low. They were already getting low reimbursements.
They were already negotiated.
What do you give us if we're below the floor? Do we get to go back up?
Yeah. And so it's this. I mean, I think everyone realizes that healthcare is incredibly complex, and the healthcare industry is incredibly complex, and setting just these broad-based targets of we're going to lower rates by X dollars doesn't account for the fact that you have, rural communities where, hospitals really are, facing margins of, close to 0%. And, any shock to them, they're out of business. And then the other thing that we saw, particularly in Colorado, is that what the insurance companies had to do is they started narrowing their networks. Fewer providers would be willing to accept the supposed low reimbursement rates. And so
providers meaning doctors, meaning facilities, meaning what?
Typically doctors, when we actually look at, different types of, particularly specialists, right, who have some market power and say, well, no, we're not going to accept this.
And narrower networks just means, all right, you're covered by this plan now. However, your options are fewer and literally farther away.
Potentially, yeah. No, there are certain network standards that ACA plans have to meet, and so they can't go too far with it. But our research suggested that they went as far as they could, effectively.
They follow the dollar,
Yeah. And so with any price regulation, whether it's rent control, whether it's telecom back in the 1960s and 1970s, smart people with a profit motive are going to find ways to mitigate the effects of it.
Right. And what we're really worried about here, right, is the supply side effects. I think you say to suppliers, to doctors, to hospitals, to pick an industry, you are no longer allowed to price based on these things. I think insurance is a really helpful one. Insurance companies want to offer insurance to cover the costs of a pool of people. And you say, well, you aren't allowed to charge like this or like this. And so therefore there are consequences that are more hidden that don't show up on the budget line, I want to say. I want to try and paint this picture of what are the inefficient effects that happen, and you and I think that they are not worth it. So I need to know the vision of how we actually want to see this, because like I'm going back to the piece that spurred this. One of the lines is, it's time to regulate prices in healthcare markets where competition cannot do the job. And this is my pet peeve, because this is the classic, this is Econ 101 without going any further, of there are market failures, right? So in any market, there's a market failure. You and I think that people define market failures terribly, but there are market failures. Therefore, we need the government to come in and fix things. And then they stop right there without asking the follow-up of, is the government good at fixing this stuff? Your two options are, it's not that you only have one option, have the government do something. It's that you have two options. One, have the government do something, see how that works. Two, are there private or market-based options that can happen and change things based on that, right?
Yeah. So I think the good example of just the innovation potential, or when we talk about it broadly, of all the different dimensions of a good that are affected when you have price controls, right? So it's future innovation, right? When we talk about drug research, it's definitely something where if you cut pharma's ability to make a profit, they're going to produce fewer life-saving drugs. In the insurance market, if you cut the ability for them to, charge actuarially fair premiums, you end up with fewer insurance companies. And ultimately you end up with, higher prices because you got fewer insurance companies. So you can really be sort of self-defeating, with doctors and hospitals. If you cut their rates, in the short term, you have fewer hospitals. Hospitals go out of business. Doctors probably stick around, but maybe they move. Maybe they move to other states that have, friendlier laws. Maybe they're less inclined to pick up patients that are on the public option or on the, that are in the individual markets. So there are options in the short term, and then of course in the long term, all these effects are magnified. That if you tell a doctor that they're going to make a whole lot less than they are now, you have fewer doctors, or you have fewer high skilled doctors, right? That the guy choosing between med school and law school, that your decision's made for you. If you all of a sudden say, doctors are just going to be, earning middle class incomes, and that's somewhat other countries have chosen, right? That other countries have made that decision to sort of select a different skill level for their primary care, particularly.
Right.
And so it's a trade off, and I think what so much of our research with public option goes to is that the Americans aren't really good with trade offs.
Right. We're just going to borrow money to pay for whatever else we need to clean up the mess we've made.
Exactly. Or we're simply not going to allow doctors to leave the market. We're going to increase their rates, right? We're going to have doc fixes, right? And so, and if you expand the pool of people that doctors are serving that are subject to these price regulations, you're increasing the incentive for doctors to go and lobby really hard to get rid of these rules. And the doc fix went away in 2015, and then so people don't talk about it anymore. But the thing that replaced the doc fix, MACRA, between MACRA and like a number of different pay-go rules that really complicated congressional budgeting issues, every year right now, docs are going back to Congress and asking for bumps in their pay because the schedule is falling for Medicare.
Right.
So you're seeing it time and time again, and the incentives are getting bigger and bigger as government takes on more and more folks. And so, so it's not going away.
All right, last part on this. Give me the alternative I want to sketch out. Let's go back to community rating. Before the ACA, there were rules in place. Basically, you can charge elderly people 5 times what you charge a young person. This kind of makes sense in terms of risk adjustment. They use a lot more services. Now ACA shows up, you can only do 3 times as much. The effects that we worry about are, okay, that raises prices, especially, it helps out people at the top level, the elderly people, but it really raises premiums at the bottom level because you've got this ban. You still need to cover your costs. You need to raise the same amount of revenue to cover the same amount of costs, basically. What would we rather see instead?
Yeah.
Leave those ratings in place or get rid of them and be a bit smarter about it, because that's a shot. That's not even a shotgun approach. That is a indiscriminate bombing approach, right? We want more targeted assistance of, okay, elderly people, one, yes, they use more care. I think you and I would say, they've spent more time. They should have some money saved up to do this. Maybe they don't, but maybe we give direct assistance to medically needy or low-income people in order to help afford these things. Elderly people who are at the prime working age or anything maybe don't need as much help. And as a result, you're going to have premiums stay low for lower-income people. They maybe look longer term and say, all right, I've got to plan for this in the future. But we don't love this idea of price regulation, and by price regulation we literally mean you aren't allowed to price according to this regulation.
The ACA is an interesting one because if you actually look at the people that, particularly before the recent expansions of the ACA, and you looked at who was on the rolls, that the community rating bands were actually reasonable, that they probably were charging about right, but only because the only young people that were buying the plans were sick people, were people with chronic conditions. And so it actually, they drove the healthy folks out of the market,
which is what you do not want to see
was
on an insurance
the penalty
market.
Was set to 0.
Yeah.
But I think going back to that original 2003 health affairs piece, it's not the prices, it's the incentives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And prices in a competitive space are incentives, but prices in this world aren't, because nobody pays them. They don't actually reflect anything. And of
They
course,
don't
when they're
reflect the
talking about
information,
prices,
right?
yeah, when they're talking about prices, they're talking about, the back end prices that matter more, right? Reimbursement rates are a price that, doctors respond to.
Right.
But the when we think of incentives, what we want to think about is, well, gee, why aren't there more hospitals in these places? Why isn't there? It's competitive. So I think this is one area where like Lena Khan, might not be too far off base when she's attacking, things like the
Broken clock is right twice a day,
yeah,
Daniel.
yeah, exactly. Certificate of public, it's COPA law. I forget the
COPA,
abbreviation
yes.
for it. Yeah.
Basically,
And
con
essentially these
laws,
are
but yeah.
states give hospitals monopoly power, and they're
Right.
allowed to essentially say, hey, we'll regulate the prices, we'll make sure prices aren't going to rise too much, and we're going to let this hospital merger happen. And you look at that and you just say, well, these are the type of things where, if there's any example of where antitrust authorities should be getting involved, this is a great place for it.
We've
And then
just
you go
given
to
up in healthcare.
and you go to con laws, right? Certificate of need laws, which is essentially states saying that if you're a new hospital and you want to expand, or you're an investor and you want to create a new hospital, you have to go seek government permission before you're allowed to build that hospital, and you have to prove to us that there is an adequate demand for your product, because the last thing we want is for you just to be wasting all these resources building a hospital when there's a hospital down the street. And any other market, you'd say, well, that's ridiculous. Of
They
course
want
we
to
want,
build.
yeah, we want to have a competing hospital down the street. Why wouldn't we? Or a competing business down the street. As a consumer, I would want that. But this goes back to these ideas in healthcare of that we're going to induce demand. If you build it, they will come. And the last thing we want to do is build more hospitals that will just drive up healthcare utilization and low care.
That was born out of the early Medicare days where health spending went up like crazy because we subsidized it, and they went, and that's where con laws came from.
Yeah.
We went, okay, we have too many beds, we're subsidizing, we're just paying anything that we're billed.
Yeah.
No, prove to us that you need it.
So
this goes back to a Milton Friedman thing. I think it's Milton Friedman who said, or our first principle, just be on the side. Like, if you don't know, be on the side of the consumer, and you're probably going to find the right
sovereignty.
answer. Yeah,
consumer sovereignty.
What's good for consumers? Lots of supply.
And in the 1980s, there was also, or in the 1970s and 80s, when they were doing con laws, there was also a whole movement to limit the number of new doctors. They closed down med schools, and because they had these projections that said, well, 10, 15, 20 years in the future, we're going to have this glut of doctors, and that's going to induce demand. And so we need to, and then all of a sudden, 20 years later, they realize that, oh, geez, the baby boomers need a lot of doctors, and now we face these shortages. And so, how do we get more people practicing medicine? Do we need to improve immigration? We need to improve the immigration system to allow, foreign providers to come in. We need to, relax licensing restrictions across state borders to allow doctors to go elsewhere. And we need to leverage technology, right? We need to be able to, telehealth is a great example of something that, why did it take a pandemic before we actually embraced the idea of telehealth? And again, it goes back to this fear that, well, telehealth was going to lead to induced demand. People were going to be calling up their doctors on a regular basis and getting prescriptions that weren't necessary. And so there was all these standard concerns of, no, if you build it, if you build it, if you expand it, all you're going to do
who's
is
going to pay for it, and by who we mean where's the government budget
yeah,
coming
because
from?
and the argument behind induced demand makes some sense, that you ultimately, if you're not paying for the care and someone else is, then maybe that extra hospital bed does get used unnecessarily. Maybe the doctor is visited too frequently. But then the question is, are there ways to give consumers more skin in the game, cost sharing, things like that, to allow them to think through their costs more considerably. But I think it goes back to, we should be more concerned about the incentives of these things, not just prices, but incentives. And the research that you and I have done over the years, Tom, with Choices for All is all about that, right?
Why doesn't everyone think with incentives? All right, I think we've covered that.
I mean, honestly, Tom, the glib answer,
yeah,
they don't necessarily have the incentive to.
Yes, that is a tautological reasoning that makes complete sense to me. Yeah.
Doesn't all tautological reasoning make sense by definition?
That's the point. All right. Next segment, Danny. New reports, new data. You and I love getting CVO emails. We race to send each other the report before the other person. There's one that came out that I think is up your alley, considering your prescription drug research with John Cogan and Casey Mulligan. Alternative approaches to reducing prescription drug prices. This is still kind of on theme here of what we're talking about on regulating prices. This is in the news mostly because the Inflation Reduction Act started negotiating, I say in air quotations, prescription drug prices. So CBO said, okay, what are the various ways you can regulate drug prices that you can hopefully drive them down? I want to run through a short list here, and I want you to give me a good idea, bad idea. Ready?
Sure.
Okay. Set the maximum allowed prices based on prices outside the United States. This is international reference pricing. Good idea, bad idea? Now, how about that? Will it lower prices?
It would lower prices, I think, for Americans. It would.
All right. At what cost?
Yeah, and that's the question, right? That there are trade offs to this. I think if you're Germany, you really hate this idea, or you should hate this idea, because if I'm a pharmaceutical company and all of a sudden, my price or the price that I'm charging in Germany affects how much I get in the U.S. market, I'm going to raise my German price,
sure.
right?
But Danny, we're not in Germany. Would that benefit us?
Yeah,
I will say this
Mm-hmm.
is the one CBO wrote about that said, hey, we might get some large reductions, like 5%, like over 5% reductions. All right.
But going back to it, it goes to the innovation stuff, right? That's the concern with this one, is that if you're and the government has, back in 2018-19, they had HR3, which was
this is the Trump administration.
So this was a bill proposed by congressional Democrats. So it would have been 2019 when they had the House.
Oh, okay, yes. Okay.
And so and then they considered it, and then they pulled out a piece of it with the Medicare prescription drug plan and for the Inflation Reduction Act. But the prescription drug price negotiation program.
All right, slight detour to innovation effects, right? Because you and I were at a conference. You actually presented at a conference 2 weeks ago at Hoover in D.C. talking about prescription drugs, and I really there were a bunch of questions on maybe fairness and access. I like this idea, and I think it's helpful to try and convince people. I want you to pitch me. Do we really think drug manufacturers are going to change what they do based on regulated prices? I mean, they want to find the next best drug with the biggest market and get a patent monopoly on that and make billions of dollars. Full stop, right? Is that right or not?
So I mean that's right, but if you adjust their incentives in ways, they'll develop different molecules. They'll do different. They'll decide to innovate differently. There might be some capital that leaves, right? I mean, every business out there, businesses respond to incentives, and for a business, like, cost of capital is what matters, right? That and your cost of capital, you're comparing and you're saying, well, gee, what's the return I need in order to make an investment worthwhile?
Sure.
And if the government cuts it in half because they say we're going to limit your drug prices to to what the Germans pay, ultimately that means that there's marginal drugs that aren't developed. And now are those like the huge drugs out there? Are those like the new weight loss drugs and things like that? Probably not, right? But it's the drugs that with probably a smaller market that are still life saving, still saving tons of lives. And when you take a step back and you say even with the big weight loss drugs, and you say that we're charging such high prices for these. And this gets to that equity argument that you mentioned a minute ago, that when you think of like fairness, and this is something that Tom Phillips at University of Chicago brought up at our conference, but the idea of, well, that weight loss drug is costing us a whole lot of money. It's going to cost taxpayers a whole lot of money if Medicare offers it, and if Medicaid programs offer it or anything like that. But in 10, 15, 20 years, the drugs go generic, and then it's very cheap. And even sooner than that, competing drugs show up that drive down prices. And when you look in the European market, what you actually find is there actually aren't as many generics that show up ever, because prices have already been pushed down so much. And so you just never get this generic competition. And so in the US, we have a system where we say, well, we really want to reward innovators for coming up with that new weight loss drug because we realize the value of that. And then within 4 or 5 years, we realize that the price of that drug, while it's obscenely high right now, it's going to fall quickly because there's going to be a competing drug that's slightly better or slightly different, and ultimately you're going to get lower prices at that point. And it's not a hypothetical, right? You go back to the Hep C world, right? Back in 2014, Gilead Sciences came out with a Hep C drug that cured hepatitis C.
Which was costing Medicare, Medicaid, I mean, government
tons of money. I mean, if you're unfamiliar,
money.
If you're unfamiliar, like Hep C, eventually your liver just you develop cirrhosis of the liver, you have to go on interferon, and then you die, or you get a liver transplant, one of the two. And Hep C, the
We're
Gilead
talking
came
hundreds
up
of
with,
thousands of dollars to cover you.
yeah,
right?
yeah, and I mean, 100,000 from the government standpoint,
Mhm.
if you're paying for a liver transplant or something like that, and then for the patient standpoint, right? I mean, like this is a miserable existence, right? You have to they give interferon on like Friday afternoons because the expectation is you won't be able to do anything for 2 days after. It destroys you. And so, you go back and you say, well, gee, that when Gilead comes out with their cure, they charge $100,000 for the full regiment. And I say cure, right? This isn't something you were on forever. This is literally you took it for 8 weeks, 9 weeks, something like that, and then you didn't have Hep C anymore. Never had to worry about liver failure. Truly miraculous. And people freaked out because they said, oh, $100,000 a regiment. And then within like 2 years after that, we stopped hearing as much from it because AbbVie, I think, came out with a competing drug. I forget. I think it was AbbVie. And all of a sudden the prices got pushed down and Gilead had to charge way less. And that's like the beauty of this market, right? That there was this huge incentive to get the drug out there as quickly as you could if you're Gilead. And then there was this big incentive for AbbVie to come in and compete with them. And the result is we have fairly cheap Hep C, cures now. Now, would it have been great if like everyone got that cure right in 2014? And yeah, sure. But if that would have come at the expense of never having that drug, there are these trade-offs in life. And so the fairness argument, I think when we think of fairness, we need to have a longer perspective that these weight loss drugs that are costing a lot of money right now, that's rewarding innovators. And in a few years from now, those innovators are no longer going to be getting the rewards from it. Consumers and patients are.
Right. The example that Phillipson gave that I really liked was, and he was asked specifically about, is this fair? These companies that have, come up with these drugs are charging so much money. And he went, yeah, it's temporary inequity for access later on. It's like cell phones in the 1980s. It was incredible. They were so expensive. Should we have come in and said everyone should have a cell phone? The government's going to pay for it. They're going to regulate it. What do you think would have happened to the iPhone later on? It just wouldn't have happened. So we accept that trade-off. The other principle that I now think about in terms of drug manufacturers and prices and profits that I think is helpful is that people focus on one company. They go, okay, this what is it, Nova? I can't remember what they're even called that came up with the GLP obesity drug. They're charging so much money for the drug right now, but the way to actually think about drug profits and investment in R&D is as a portfolio. You see only one company with the profits they are making. What you should really think about it is how many companies invested how much money in R&D and how much money they all lost. And then what's the payoff? The payoff is really going to one company here and then future companies as they compete. But it's a different, I guess, I'm looking at it as a different kind of market. It makes sense to me that in an industry where there are lots and lots of losers and one winner, yeah, that's a reward for innovation. Everyone wants to innovate and should get that payoff. If there's an industry where there's, not really anyone loses and everyone wins, yeah, we don't expect them to all charge a lot of money. That doesn't make any sense. I don't look at it in an envious or unfairness term there. I think that arithmetically makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think and this is something where drug industry always makes the case, right? That they have to spend on average something like $2 billion to get one drug approved from the FDA, and that $2 billion includes the capitalized expense of all the drugs that didn't work, right? And so they have to spend a lot of money, and then you look at the return of that, and you say, well, once you account for that, the probability, the low probability of success, they make pretty much average market returns. They go and get. If drug makers are doing so great, look at like a drug index fund right now. It looks, looks like it's doing about as good as the rest of the market,
They're
which is
not
what you'd
beating
expect,
Nvidia, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There you go. I like that. All right, let me close out on this CBO prescription drug.
Well, we didn't go through the list. I'll be quick.
No, I'm going to. I'm going to go through the list.
Okay, got it.
I want to go through the list because I think this is people look at this and go, okay, how do we bring prescription drug prices down? Require manufacturers to pay inflation rebates for sales in commercial markets. In other words, they got to pay rebates based on how well they're doing.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, CBO, when the Inflation Reduction Act came out, the Inflation Reduction Act includes a provision for inflation rebates for Medicare prescription drug, Part D. And what they said is, for drugs that are currently on the market, this will have some effect because you've already priced the drug, and so now you're stuck with that price. For every new drug that comes on the market, manufacturers will just raise their launch price to account for it. And if you're familiar with drug pricing is incredibly opaque. There's what the list price of the drug versus what we actually pay for it. The example, like in the car space, right? It's MSRP versus invoice. But in this case, the invoice, nobody really sees it. People just have to guess unless you're like with the company. Well, I guess CMS knows for some drugs now. But because of that, very easy for you to set a really high list price and then keep that list price from rising while still raising your net price just by lowering rebates that you're offering folks. And so CBO said you don't get much savings over the long term, particularly after this wave of drugs that have already been priced, fall by the wayside.
Right. So I don't think we need to go through the whole list here. It's small to very small effects on prices. Things like increasing transparency in brand name drug prices, earlier market entry for generic and biosimilar drugs, eliminate or limit direct-to-consumer prescription drug advertising. It's a lot of people going, "Oh, this should have some. Why aren't we doing this?" Well, CBO was like, "It doesn't have that much of an effect."
Yeah, and let me. I was bouncing this idea off you a couple weeks ago, and I have not mentioned this to other people really, but with the increased transparency in brand name drugs, I think that's actually it's an interesting one from a political side, because when you go back to just how opaque the pricing model is. People see that the list price of these drugs are rising incredibly, and they don't realize that the net price actually isn't rising by much. That, people are surprised when I tell them that if you go back to 2009 and look at how much Part D, the Medicare prescription drug plan, costs per enrollee, it's essentially been flat, adjusted for inflation. That there's been no growth above just the normal rate of inflation for everything. But you look at the list price, and the list prices are rising dramatically. And there are like good economic reasons why, if you're an individual drug company, you want to have this opaque pricing system, because it allows you to essentially use rebates to increase utilization and things like that. And if you're a PBM, you certainly don't want to lose a big rebate system. PBM being the pharmacy benefit managers, who are actually the intermediaries, the middlemen between the two. But there's a case to be made that while the pricing makes sense for individual molecules, once you throw all the drug space in there, what the opaque pricing system does is it's really undermining pharma's case, right? Because pharma can go and say, hey, our net price actually isn't rising by much. Look at Part D. Part D's the expenses aren't growing by much. And some of that is because of generic competition and all these other reasons. But some of it's just because the net prices aren't rising by as fast as people think. Now, no one individual firm would have an incentive to go and do that, because they make more money with this opaque pricing scheme. But as an industry, what's happened is they lose that political argument, and so it might make case. And so this is why CBO actually said, I don't know if this is exactly the reason why CBO said, but CBO did say that increased transparency might actually raise prices. That the PBMs of the world, the rebates and everything, are pushing down prices in ways. And if you get rid of this transparency, you lose that to some extent, is what CBO says. And so I think you can make a political case. You weaken a whole lot of the case for more drug price regulation, just if people see what we're actually paying for these drugs, which isn't as much as people think.
I think we'll do a future show on Part D premium changes based on the Inflation Reduction Act and the subsidies that the Biden administration has had to give to insurance companies. I think that's another clear example of what happens when you regulate prices. You get all these negative effects. We should have covered it here. I think we'll do it on another show.
Yeah, it's distinct. I actually think because these are with the premium stuff. It was CBO and the Biden administration really screwed up on their way of thinking about the premium stuff. So yeah, it's distinct from actual price regulation. They messed up.
We'll get into that. All right, I think we covered that well enough. Really quickly, I like pulling up interesting polls every once in a while. There's one. I just want your quick reaction, Danny. I love this Gallup poll. Ready? Majority of Americans feel worse off now than they did 4 years ago. 4 years ago, meaning the fall of the first 2020 COVID year. Danny, if you were going to measure how healthy the economy is doing, what would you look into? What are your measures? What are your? I'm going to go here, 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 here.
Well, it's how well my personal portfolio is doing, obviously, Thomas. But clearly not for other people, because I think most people, if they would look at their portfolio or what their, people are, when you look at statistics. Incomes are rising.
What do you got?
So when you look at income, when you look at wealth, right, you've seen a rather dramatic increase over the last handful of years. I would say that I think people sort of the the left and even some on the right, we underestimated just how much inflation matters, right? And even to the point where, you got the Biden administration this past year really trying to focus on the second derivative of the price level.
All right, come on.
Hey, you
Danny.
began this with, we're
I
over a
know.
complex show, right? So
Yeah.
when you think of, right, when we think of the price level, we think how much are we paying for things? Inflation is how much more are we paying for things, or how much less are we paying for things? And then the second derivative of that is, or the second derivative of the price level with respect to time is, Tom is signing to me that this is too technical now.
No. I
The-
was literally.
yeah.
I'm
Okay. You're
working out
miming what the
second derivative
it's
does.
the change of the change, right? So it's
That's right.
how fast inflation is changing. And the Biden administration really wanted people to focus on the second derivative, right?
Yeah.
They really wanted us to
We
think
slowed it
that,
down. Yeah.
hey, we slowed down inflation, but prices are still rising, and prices are still much higher than they were 4 years ago.
Right.
And when you go to the store and you're spending 20% more than you were 4 years ago, you're going to feel worse off, even if your income is 25% higher than it was 4 years ago. There is sort of a sticker shock to that. Even, if I can do the math, and, Tom and I have very elaborate budgets that we look at regularly, and like, we're doing much better off than we were 4 years ago. And when you look at, general income statistics, most people are. But it's not surprising to me at all that people still think the economy's bad. But I will say, like, these polls I always dislike these polls because sometimes I feel like the way people answer these is it's through a political lens. It's
Okay,
right.
so
I'm
a
correct. Republican.
I'm not even. I didn't tell you this because it is split up. I wish there were the better crosstabs. We'll link the poll in the show notes. But 72% of Democrats said they were better off than they were 4 years ago. Something like 35% of independents, and then 7% of Republicans said they were better off 4 years ago than now. So, what do we think would happen to their responses come, November?
Change the letter in front of the president's name, and you get very different results, regardless of the other income effects.
And
so
that
some of this
is
is just
not how we
right?
need to measure things.
So,
this is why I want to know.
Well, this is why you love you have this as interesting polls. I never find polls interesting because they're all shaded by politics, right? And
all right, maybe I'll go look for polls that aren't shaded by politics.
No,
right?
I mean that you can't, right? But I think you look at how people are behaving. Are they actually? If you feel like you were worse off 4 years ago, are you spending less? Right? Do you spend in terms of goods, not dollar amounts, because obviously that's a function of the price level. But are you actually, so, and when you pop up consumer expenditure surveys and things like that, and you don't see people reducing their aggregate spending, which suggests that people don't feel like they're worse off in the long run. That if you believe in the permanent income hypothesis, that's got to tell you that people think they're going to be doing just fine in the future, and they're spending like it.
Who doesn't believe in the permanent income hypothesis? All right, I love this. Danny, let's end on our veto of the week, which is, by the way, why we call this 584 vetoes. That is how many vetoes President Grover Cleveland issued over his 2 non-consecutive presidential terms. And we think that they are absolutely hilarious. I pulled up just the first one. I think we don't even need to find a random one. You can just go in order. So do you want to read this? Do you want me to read this, Daniel? I'll do it. Okay. So July 30th, 1885, a mere, what is that, March, April, 3 months after he takes office, President Cleveland vetoes a bill to construct a federal building in Springfield, Missouri, explaining that despite the city's prosperity and population of about 20,000 people, the only federal operations there are a post office with 6 employees and a land office. And since the post office space was being provided for free, and the land office only costs $300 per year in rent, and no federal courts operated there, he concludes that there's no justification for the expense of constructing a new federal building. We're not building just to build. Do we have enough there? It's working. It's cheap. Good enough. So he signs it. Upon the facts presented, I am satisfied that the business of the government at this point can be well transacted for the present without the construction of the proposed building. Imagine that, Danny. We're not handing out free buildings.
So can we? I think what we need to do is ask whether or not he won Missouri in the next election or not.
We can. We'll look that up.
We should look into this. Yeah. How often is he really undermining his electoral prospects through his high-mindedness?
Yeah. You know what? That's some PhD political science student should go through and look at vetoes, where they are, and do presidents respond based on where they need to win.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the flip side of that is, well, maybe there's a simultaneity issue there, right, or an endogeneity issue there, right? That
Of course there is,
you know,
Danny, but
maybe,
you know what?
maybe
You need
the reason why he vetoed this one is because he knew he wasn't getting Missouri anyways, right? So
There you go.
so you'd have to look at states where he won the first time and then didn't win the second time and see if there was a.
This
too
sounds
many
like the
vetoes.
conclusion to every presentation of an academic paper ever.
On the other hand,
Exactly.
yeah.
All right. Hey, I think that's pretty good for our first actual episode of 584 Vetoes. Thanks you for listening. We would love to have this be a bit more listener feedback oriented. My life is mostly reading things and then asking Danny to explain why I'm wrong or why it's wrong, or how to even think about these issues. So if you have feedback, if you have questions about any policies, if you have arguments that you want to test out, and we'll put them in front of Danny, send them to feedback@584vetoes.com, or find me on Twitter. It's @TomVChurch. Danny is unreachable. He's the Ron Swanson of social media. If you can find him in person, then you can ask him questions. Otherwise, we'll put him here. All right. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time. The views and opinions expressed on 584 Vetoes are those of the authors at a particular moment in time and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of their employers or their future selves.